The silence is the first thing you truly understand. It is not the absence of noise, but a presence in itself. A thick, heavy blanket woven from years of unspoken words and unheard footsteps. You are a prince of the Ottoman Empire, and your home is a suite of rooms known as the Kafes, the cage. The light that filters through the high, barred windows is always muted, painting the lavish silks and gilded carvings in shades of grey. You have books, but the words blur. You have servants, but their eyes are empty, their tongues still. Your only real companion is a specific, cold dread that lies in your stomach. It awakens with you each morning and watches you as you sleep. Every distant sound from the world outside the call to prayer, the cry of a gull over the Bosporus, the faint echo of a military parade is a reminder of a life you will never lead. The most terrifying sound, however, is the one that is closest, the click of the lock in your heavy wooden door. It could mean your meal is arriving. It could mean a physician has been sent. Or it could mean your brother, the Sultan, is dead, and the men who now enter have come with a silk bowstring to ensure you never challenge the succession of his son. You do not know which it will be. You have lived with this uncertainty for 22 years. The silence is a coffin, and you are already inside. This experience, a constant oscillation between gilded luxury and existential terror, was not a hypothetical scenario. It was the institutionalized reality for generations of Ottoman princes. Before we unseal these forgotten records, consider this a moment to register your presence. A like serves as your signature, and a subscription grants you access to all future findings provided you believe these stories must be unearthed. We invite you to share the name of the historical figure you believe has been most profoundly misunderstood by posterity. And now the preamble is over. Let us turn to the primary sources and begin the slow work of reconstruction. To comprehend the psychological environment that produced Sultan Ibrahim I, one must first examine the mechanism that placed him in the cage, the Ottoman law of succession. Unlike the European model of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits, Ottoman tradition held that any son of the reigning sultan had an equal claim to the throne. The Turkish principle was stuck: sovereignty is indivisible. This created a lethal crucible following the death of a sultan. Often governing provinces across the empire would race to the capital, and the first to be acclaimed by the court, the clergy, and the elite janissary corps became the new ruler. His first official act, almost without exception, was to order the elimination of all his brothers and their male children. This practice was not mere barbarism, it was cold, calculated state policy. The early centuries of the empire had been repeatedly scarred by devastating civil wars between rival claimants. The war between the sons of Bayezid I, for instance, lasted over a decade and nearly shattered the young empire. When Sultan Mehmed I, the conqueror of Constantinople, codified the laws of the empire in the 15th century, he gave this brutal necessity the force of law. His decree was unambiguous: for the welfare of the state, the one of my sons to whom God grants the sultanate may lawfully put his brothers to death. It was framed as a regrettable but essential sacrifice, the lives of a few princes for the stability and integrity of the realm. For the next century and a half, this law was followed with ruthless efficiency. Upon ascending the throne, a new sultan would dispatch executioners, often high-ranking officials, to every location where a brother, a nephew, or even a male cousin resided. The chosen method was strangulation with a silk bowstring, a practice that avoided the spilling of royal blood, which was considered taboo. In 1595, Sultan Mehmed I began his reign by ordering the execution of his 19 brothers, some of them infants still nursing. The historical record, as chronicled by observers like the historian Abd al-Qadir al-Jilani, notes that the line of coffins leaving the Topkapi Palace was a profound public spectacle. This was the system in its purest, most brutal form. It ensured that once a sultan was on the throne, his authority was absolutely unchallenged by familial rivals. But it also saturated the imperial family with a culture of profound and justified paranoia. The shift that led directly to the cage came at the beginning of the 17th century. Sultan Ahmad I, who had himself been spared as a youth, showed a reluctance to execute his own mentally unstable brother Mustafa, perhaps due to personal affection, a lack of a male heir at the time of his own accession, or public weariness with the constant killings, Ahmed broke with tradition. Instead of killing Mustafa, he confined him. Thus the Kafes was established as a formal institution. It was presented as a humane alternative to fratricide. Princes would no longer be killed, they would simply be sequestered, living in luxurious imprisonment within the palace walls, guarded undisolated until they were either called to the throne or died of natural causes. This innovation, however, solved one problem only to create a far more insidious one. The old system, for all its brutality, had ensured that potential sultans often had experience as provincial governors, military commanders, and statesmen. They had to fight for the throne, proving their competence. The cage did the opposite. It took healthy young men and sealed them away from the world, denying them any practical experience of governance, society, or even basic human interaction. It became a factory for producing damaged rulers, and it was within the silent, gilded walls of this institution that the future Sultan Ibrahim would spend the entirety of his formative years, waiting for the sound of the lock turning in his door. Ibrahim was born in the year 1615, a son of Sultan Ahmed I and his favored consort. He entered a world where the new system of princely confinement had just begun to replace the old law of obligatory fratricide. His childhood was therefore not defined by the certainty of a violent death upon his father's demise, but by the far more corrosive uncertainty of a life lived at the perpetual mercy of others. He was one of many sons, a minor variable in the complex calculus of dynastic survival. The palace itself, the sprawling top-copy, was less a home than a self-contained universe of overlapping hierarchies. His early years would have been spent almost exclusively within the confines of the imperial harem, a domain of immense political power wielded by his mother, the Valide Sultan, and administered by a legion of eunuchs. His father, Ahmed I, died in 1617 when Ibrahim was only 2 years old. This event plunged the empire into a period of acute instability that would form the backdrop of Ibrahim's formative years. The throne was first given to Ahmed's brother, the mentally infirm Mustafa I, who was released from the cage for a brief and chaotic reign. He was soon deposed in favor of Ibrahim's oldest half-brother, Osman I, a young, ambitious but politic period, one that would have sent tremors through the very foundations of the palace, was Osman's own deposition and subsequent murder in 1622 at the hands of the disaffected Janissary Corps. For a child like Ibrahim, living in the protected core of the palace, the lesson would have been subliminal but profound. Not even the reigning sultan was safe. Power was a fragile, dangerous commodity. In 1623, following a second brief restoration of Mustafa, the throne passed to Ibrahim's full brother, Murad I. Ibrahim was 8 years old. Because Murad himself was only 11, actual power resided with their mother, Qasim Sultan, who ruled as the first official regent in the empire's history. For the next decade, Ibrahim and his brothers Bayezid, Sulaiman, and Qasim lived under their mother's formidable protection. This period may have represented the only semblance of normalcy in their lives. They were educated together within the palace, potential rivals buffered from one another by the matriarchal authority that depended on their collective survival. However, as Murad matured, he began to resent his mother's control. After a Janissary revolt in 1632, he seized the reins of power with an iron grip, ending Qasim's regency and inaugurating an era of absolute and often brutal personal rule. Murad I proved to be a formidable military leader and a ruthless administrator. He restored order to the capital with public executions on strict prohibitions, projecting an image of fearsome strength. This transformation in his brother's character fundamentally altered the psychological climate of the court and, most critically, the environment for the remaining princes. The shield of their mother's regency was gone. They were now subject entirely to the will and the growing paranoia of a battle-hardened autocrat. The systematic elimination of Ibrahim's brothers began in 1635. Prince Bayezid, a popular and capable half-brother, was executed on Murad's orders following a successful campaign in Yerevan. Historical accounts suggest that Murad perceived Bayezid's popularity with the army as a direct threat. For the 20-year-old Ibrahim, this event would have marked the end of his childhood. A brother he had grown up with was suddenly gone, a victim of the very law the cage was meant to prevent. The terror intensified 3 years later, in 1638, as Murad prepared to lead his army on the pivotal campaign to reconquer Baghdad. He made a cold calculation. He could not risk a palace coup in his absence. He therefore ordered the execution of his two remaining brothers, Suleiman and Qasim. Ibrahim was now the last surviving male of the Ottoman dynasty apart from the Sultan himself. His survival was a matter of dynastic necessity, yet this did not make him safe. He was now the sole focus of Murad's suspicion. According to the accounts of contemporary observers, including the Venetian ambassador, Ibrahim lived in a state of constant, debilitating fear. Every summons from his brother, every unfamiliar face in the corridor, carried the potential of a death sentence. He reportedly adopted a posture of extreme subservience and simplicity, careful never to show any sign of ambition or even intelligence that might be misconstrued as a threat. This was the crucible that forged his adult mind. Years of witnessing the systematic execution of his siblings, living under the absolute power of a volatile and violent brother, where survival depended on effacing one's own personality. He was not merely confined, he was being psychologically dismantled, piece by piece, long before he was fully locked away. The Kafes was not a dungeon. It would be a profound analytical error to envision it as a space of crude physical deprivation. The suites were opulently furnished, adorned with the finest Isnik tiles, silk carpets from Persia, and woodwork inlaid with mother of pearl. The princes were attended by a select retinue of servants, typically deaf mutes, to prevent the transmission of sensitive information, or the formation of conspiracies. They ate from porcelain and silver, wore robes of brocade and fur, and had access to libraries and tutors. The cruelty of the cage was not inflicted upon the body, but directly upon the mind. It was a meticulously designed apparatus for psychological deconstruction through sensory and social isolation. For Ibrahim, the transition into the cage following the execution of his brothers in 1638 was not a dramatic change of scenery, but an intensification of an already existing condition. He moved from a state of controlled confinement to one of absolute sequestration. The core principle of the Kafes was the complete severance of the inmate from the functioning world. He could receive no unauthorized visitors. He could send no messages. His entire perception of the empire he might one day rule was filtered through the carefully selected words of his guards or the occasional, politically calculated visit from his mother, Qasim Sultan. The world outside ceased to be a tangible reality and became an abstraction, a distant rumor. The daily routine within the cage was a study in profound monotony. Time itself would have become fluid, unstructured by the meaningful events that shape a normal human life. The days were marked only by the shifting light through the grilles of the windows, the 5 calls to prayer, and the arrival of meals. This temporal dislocation is a well-documented tool in psychological warfare and re-education. It serves to unmoor the individual from their own sense of linear progression and agency. Without purpose, appointment, or responsibility, the mind begins to turn inward, feeding on its own anxieties and obsessions. Ibrahim had no peers, no friends, no one with whom he could share a candid thought or a moment of genuine emotional connection. The servants were presences, not people. Their deafness and muteness made them living furniture, reinforcing his solitude. Furthermore, the environment was one of constant, low-level dread. The silence was punctuated by the awareness of being perpetually watched. Every action was observed, every word potentially reported. This surveillance erodes the very concept of a private self. The prince learned that authentic expression was a liability. Spontaneity, ambition, frustration all had to be suppressed in favor of a placid, non-threatening demeanor. This enforced passivity, maintained over years, would have had a catastrophic effect on the development of a mature personality. Decision-making faculties atrophy when there are no decisions to be made. Social skills wither in the absence of a society. The will to act is extinguished when any action is futile. The most critical aspect of the cage's psychological impact was the constant, looming threat of execution. This was not a vague fear, but a concrete, institutionalized possibility. For Ibrahim, the memory of his brother's fates was a visceral reality. He knew intimately that his life hung by the thinnest of threads. The health and whim of Sultan Murad IV. Murad was a robust, martial figure, but he was also a heavy drinker and prone to violent rages. Every rumor of the Sultan's illness would have been a moment of complex terror for Ibrahim. On one hand, his brother's death was his only path to freedom. On the other, Murad's death could easily proceed in order for his own execution, to clear the path for a different faction or simply as a final act of dynastic paranoia. Ibrahim was trapped in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a death either his brother's or his own. This prolonged exposure to intense stress, uncertainty, and isolation is known to produce a range of psychological pathologies. Chronic anxiety, depression, paranoia, and a detachment from reality are common outcomes. In Ibrahim's case, the historical record suggests the development of severe nervous tics, bouts of debilitating headaches, and a general state of mental fragility. In doing so, it also rendered him unfit to rule. It created a vacuum at the core of his being, a space that would later be filled by the most basic and distorted impulses: fear, superstition, and sensory gratification. The man who would eventually be led out of the cage was not the man who had entered it. He was a psychological artifact. A human ruin created by a system that chose mental destruction was a more civilized alternative to physical death. In early February of the year 1640, Sultan Murad IV, the conqueror of Baghdad and the terror of his own court, lay dying. His robust constitution had been systematically destroyed by years of excessive drinking. Gout and cirrhosis of the liver had reduced the fearsome warrior to a bloated, delirious invalid. News of the Sultan's imminent demise spread through the corridors of Topkapi Palace not as a whisper of grief, but as a current of pure political electricity. For the Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, and for the Sultan's mother, Qasem Sultan, it was a moment of supreme crisis management. For Ibrahim, isolated within the Kafes, the rumors that inevitably penetrated his seclusion would have signaled the approach of the single most dangerous moment of his life. The historical accounts of Murad's final hours, though colored by palace intrigue and later embellishments, converge on a single, chilling narrative. The dying Sultan, in a final paroxysm of autocratic fury, is said to have given one last order: the execution of his brother. His rationale, as reported by chronicles, was a flash of terrifying lucidity amidst his delirium. He allegedly declared that a madman like Ibrahim was unfit to rule and that leaving him alive would doom the empire, therefore to extinguish the Ottoman bloodline entirely, leaving the throne to his trusted friend, the Khan of Crimea. This account, whether entirely factual or a later invention to dramatize the events, reflects a sentiment that was likely very real. Murad, a ruler who understood power in its most absolute terms, recognized the profound damage the Kafes had inflicted upon his heir. His solution was not to reform the system, but to eliminate its product. The order was delivered. The executioners were summoned. At this critical juncture, the machinery of the state was halted by a single individual, Qasem Sultan. Her actions in these hours were not driven by maternal affection, but by a precise and sentimental political calculation. The death of Ibrahim meant the end of her lineage's claim to the throne. It meant the end of her own position as the Validi Sultan, the mother of the reigning monarch, a post of almost unimaginable power and wealth. Her entire life's work, the careful navigation of the treacherous currents of the imperial court, would be for nothing. She intervened directly, using her immense influence with the leading figures of the Divan, the imperial council. She argued that the command of a delirious, dying man was not valid. She persuaded the Grand Vizier and the other officials that the survival of the dynasty was paramount. It could not survive a succession crisis that would pit the Crimean Khans against the established Ottoman elite. Her counter-argument prevailed. The executioners were halted. Sultan Murad IV died on the 8th of February, 1640. The throne was, by every law and tradition, now Ibrahim's. A formal delegation was assembled, comprising the highest officials of the empire, the Grand Vizier, the Syhu el-Islam, who was the chief religious authority, and the chief black eunuch, the powerful administrator of the harem, and escort him to the throne room for the ceremony of accession. For Ibrahim, the sequence of events was an exercise in pure terror. The usual quiet of his confinement was broken by the sound of multiple, heavy footsteps approaching his door. The bolts were drawn back with a grim finality. The door swung open to reveal not a servant with a meal, but the most powerful men in the Ottoman world. Their faces were solemn, their posture rigid with the gravity of the occasion. But Ibrahim could not interpret this scene as it was intended. Conditioned by 22 years of dread and the fresh memory of his brother's fates, processed the information through the only lens it had, the expectation of death. He saw not a delegation of kingmakers, but a formal procession of executioners. He recoiled into the darkest corner of his chamber, his body trembling. He was convinced that Murad's final act of fraternal cruelty was at hand, and that these great men of state had come not to offer him an empire, but to preside over the methodical extinguishing of his life with a silk bowstring. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, stepped forward. As the supreme executive authority of the empire, his voice was accustomed to absolute and immediate obedience. He performed the traditional prostration and addressed the cowering figure in the corner, using the full, formal titles of the newly ascended sovereign. He announced the passing of Sultan Ibrahim I from a decree of Allah and proclaimed the accession of Sultan Ibrahim I. The words, which should have been a key unlocking the world, were received as a death sentence. Ibrahim's response was not one of relief or gratitude, but of panicked, incoherent denial. He barricaded himself further into the corner of the room, using a small table as a makeshift shield, and began to wail, pleading for his life. He accused the vizieress of a cruel deception, a ruse designed to lure where the executioners could more easily complete their work. The situation had devolved into a constitutional crisis within a single, locked chamber. The empire technically had a new ruler, but that ruler was in a state of catatonic refusal, convinced that his own government was a conspiracy to murder him. The pleas and sworn oaths of the Grand Vizier and the Chyhul Islam were useless. Their authority, which rested on centuries of established protocol and the symbolic power of their officers, meant nothing to a mind for which the only reality was the imminent threat of the bowstring. Ibrahim's psychological conditioning had been too perfect. In the closed world of the Kafes, suspicion was not a pathology, it was the supreme survival mechanism. He had stayed alive by trusting no one and assuming the worst. To abandon that mindset now, in the very moment of ultimate vulnerability, was a psychological impossibility. The impasse continued for a considerable time. The highest officials of the state were held hostage by the terror of their new master. Finally, faced with an unprecedented problem, they resorted to the only authority who might penetrate Ibrahim's wall of fear, his mother. Kafes Sultan was summoned. She arrived not as a grieving mother or a comforting parent, but as the ultimate political pragmatist. She understood her son's shattered psyche in a way the statesman could not. She recognized that his condition was not a matter of reason, but of pure visceral terror. Oaths and promises were abstractions. He required something tangible, something absolute. Listening to her son's frantic denials from behind the door, she understood what he needed. Ibrahim was demanding proof. In his panicked state, he fixated on a singular, macabre condition for his emergence. He would not believe he was sultan until he saw his brother's corpse with his own eyes. The demand was shocking. It violated every imperial taboo surrounding the dignity of a deceased monarch. The body of the sultan was a sacred vessel, not a piece of evidence to be presented for inspection. The state needed a functioning sovereign. The longer the throne remained symbolically empty, the greater the risk of a janissary uprising or a factional power grab. Kafes Sultan made the decision. Protocol would have to be sacrificed for the sake of stability. She gave the order. The mortal remains of Sultan Murad I were brought from his deathbed. The procession that carried the body to the doors of the Kafes was a somber, surreal spectacle, the dead ruler being presented to the living one as proof of life. The corpse was laid on a bier before the entrance to Ibrahim's chambers. Only then, with his mother's assurances and the undeniable visual evidence before him, did Ibrahim begin to accept the truth. He crept forward slowly, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He gazed upon the still face of the brother whose power had defined the entirety of his existence, whose whim could have ended his life at any moment. He saw not a sultan, but a dead man. The sight broke the paralysis. The fear of execution finally receded, but it was not replaced by joy or ambition. Instead, a new, overwhelming wave of anxiety took its place, the terror of the world outside the cage. He had spent his entire adult life in a few rooms, shielded from all responsibility. Now, he was being asked to govern one of the world's most powerful and complex empires. The officials helped him to his feet. He was 34 years old, but had the bewildered, terrified demeanor of a lost child. As he was led out of the Kafes, he reportedly turned to his mother and said, "The world, which I had forgotten, is born again." He was now Sultan Ibrahim I, the absolute ruler of the Ottoman Empire, and he was utterly, fundamentally broken. The accession ceremony, or kulus, of Sultan Ibrahim was a muted affair, marked by a palpable sense of unease among the assembled dignitaries. The new ruler of the Ottoman world stood before them, not as a figure of authority, but as a man visibly overwhelmed, his gaze shifting nervously, his body language communicating a profound desire to be anywhere else. He performed the required rituals, the girding of the sword of Osman, the acceptance of oaths of loyalty from the viziers and military commanders, but his participation was mechanical, a pantomime directed by the officials around him. It was immediately apparent to all present that the throne was occupied by a cipher. Nature and politics both abhor a vacuum. The power vacuum created by Ibrahim's incapacity was immediately undefectively filled by his mother, Kafes Sultan. This was not a new role for her. Born Anastasia to a Greek priest on the island of Chinos, she had been brought to the harem as a young girl, where her intelligence sinker is caught the eye of Sultan Ahmad I, as his favored consort Hossekai and the mother of many of his sons, including Murad and Ibrahim. She had long been a central figure in palace politics. Most importantly, she had served as the official regent for Murad during his minority, governing the empire in her right for nearly a decade. She was, by 1640, one of the most experienced and formidable political operators in the Ottoman state. She became the sole conduit to the Sultan. All state papers, petitions, and ambassadorial reports were brought to her first. She would review them, make her decisions, and then, if necessary, present a summary to her son for his purely formal approval. Access to Ibrahim was strictly controlled. He was shielded from the complexities of governance, a task for which he had neither the training nor the temperament. In effect, Kafes Sultan placed her son back into a new, more luxurious version of the cage. He was free to wander the palace grounds, to indulge his senses, but he was just as isolated from real power as he had been before. The empire was run by a duumvirate, the Validi Sultan in the palace and the Grand Vizier in his chancery, the Sublime Porte. For the first few years of Ibrahim's reign, this arrangement provided a crucial measure of stability. The momentum of Murad I's strict rule, combined with the competent administration of Qasem and Kara Mustafa, kept the ship of state on a steady course. The military remained disciplined, the treasury was slowly refilled, and the vast bureaucracy continued to function. To an outside observer, it might have seemed that the transition of power had been successful, but the state itself was strong. However, this very stability contained the seeds of future disaster. By taking on the full burden of governance, Qasem and the Grand Vizier relieved Ibrahim of all responsibility. They created an environment in which his damaged psyche was not forced to heal or adapt, but was instead allowed to fester and devolve. With no duties to occupy his mind, no meaningful decisions to make, the new sultan's attention turned inward, toward the disordered landscape of his own desires and anxieties. He had spent his life in a state of sensory deprivation and constant fear. Now placed at the apex of a world of limitless wealth and power, with no one to deny him any whim, his long-suppressed impulses began to emerge, not as the reasoned choices of a monarch, but as the raw, unmediated compulsions of a traumatized mind. Qasem's ambition had saved the state in the short term, but by protecting her son from the world, she was inadvertently nurturing the madness that would eventually consume them all. While the regency of Qasem Sultan provided a facade of functional governance, the instrument of that governance, the Sultan himself, was fundamentally broken. A clinical assessment of Ibrahim's mental state upon his accession, based on the descriptive accounts of contemporary Ottoman chronicles and foreign observers like the Venetian Bailo, reveals a complex of pathologies consistent with a lifetime of profound psychological trauma. The man who sat on the throne was not an empty vessel, but one filled with a maelstrom of anxieties, unprocessed memories, and debilitating cognitive deficits. His condition was not a secret. It was the central, unspoken reality around which the entire court was forced to navigate. The most dominant feature of his disposition was a severe and persistent anxiety disorder, rooted in decades of justified paranoia. Though he was now the absolute master of the empire, his mind remained trapped in the logic of the Kafes. He was prone to sudden panic attacks, often triggered by loud noises, unfamiliar faces, or any deviation from his rigidly controlled routine. He reportedly suffered from violent, incapacitating headaches that would leave him prostrate for days, during which time he would refuse all contact. This hypervigilance manifested as a deep-seated suspicion of everyone around him, including the very viziers who depended on his authority. He would fixate on perceived slights, interpreting innocent gestures or remarks as evidence of elaborate conspiracies against his life. The fear of the bowstring, or rational terror in the cage, had become an irrational, free-floating phobia in the palace. His emotional state was characterized by extreme volatility. Observers noted his rapid and unpredictable shifts between a state of deep, melancholic lethargy and sudden, explosive fits of rage. He could be listless and unresponsive for extended periods, seemingly detached from his surroundings, only to erupt in a fury over the most trivial of matters: the taste of a dish, the color of a robe, a misplaced object. These outbursts were not the calculated anger of a monarch seeking to impose his will, but the uncontrolled, dysregulated tantrums of a mind unable to manage its own internal stimuli. This unpredictability made him terrifying to his attendants. No one knew what might provoke the Sultan's wrath, turning a routine interaction into a potentially fatal encounter. Cognitively, the years of isolation had inflicted catastrophic damage. Ibrahim lacked the most basic faculties required for governance. His education, while perhaps theoretically sound in subjects like theology and literature, was devoid of any practical application. He had no understanding of geography, economics, military strategy, or the complex social dynamics of the empire he was supposed to lead. More critically, his executive functions, the ability to plan, to reason, to weigh consequences, and to make rational decisions, were severely impaired. He struggled with abstract thought and appeared incapable of grasping the chain of cause and effect beyond his immediate, personal experience. Presented with a state document, his attention would drift. His mind could not process the dense, impersonal information. In the place of these atrophied higher functions, his consciousness retreated to more elemental modes of perception. His interaction with the world became almost entirely sensory. Having been starved of normal stimuli for so long, he now engaged with his environment through an obsessive focus on tactile and olfactory sensations. He developed a powerful fixation on textures, particularly the feel of soft fabrics and furs. He found comfort and meaning in scents, burning vast quantities of expensive incense and ambergris throughout the palace. He was drawn to bright colors and shimmering jewels. This was not the refined appreciation of a connoisseur. It was the desperate grounding mechanism of a man whose internal world was a source of constant pain. He sought to overwhelm his anxiety with a flood of pleasant physical sensations. The shattered instrument of the Sultanate, incapable of producing the complex music of statecraft, could only generate the simple, repetitive notes of sensory compulsion. The court, under Qasem's direction, initially indulged these tendencies as harmless eccentricities, a way to keep the Sultan pacified. They did not yet understand that these compulsions were not a sideshow to his reign. They were destined to become its central driving force. This retreat into a purely sensory existence necessitated a formal and total abdication of the duties of governance. The Sultan, incapable of and uninterested in the complex machinery of the state, was content to delegate his absolute authority, provided his personal comfort and diversions were not disturbed. For the first 4 years of his reign, from 1640 to 1644, the Ottoman Empire was effectively governed by the Regency Council, a duumvirate of power shared between his mother, Qasem Sultan, and the formidable Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha. The Sultan was the theoretical source of all authority, but the actual exercise of that authority resided entirely with them. His role was reduced to affixing his imperial seal, the tug HRA, to documents he rarely read and could not comprehend. The administration of Kara Mustafa Pasha was a continuation of the harsh but effective policies of the previous reign. He was a product of the severe, meritocratic but unforgiving Ottoman bureaucracy. His primary objectives were official responsibility and the rooting out of corruption. He conducted a thorough review of the state's finances, slashing extravagant expenditures and imposing strict controls on the treasury. He cracked down on the widespread practice of selling government offices to the highest bidder, attempting to restore a measure of merit to the system of appointments. He confronted the powerful provincial governors who had grown as semi-independent warlords, reasserting the central government's authority. He also maintained the discipline of the Janissary Corps, the elite military force whose frequent rebellions had destabilized previous reigns. He was the janitor of the empire, diligently sweeping out the decay that had accumulated, and for a time his efforts brought a period of common order, while the Grand Vizier wrestled with budgets and rebellions, and the valid Sultan managed the intricate politics of the imperial household. Ibrahim constructed a world for himself within the palace walls that catered exclusively to his disordered needs. His days were not structured by the meetings of the divan or the reception of ambassadors, but by a languid procession of sensory indulgences. He spent countless hours in the harem, not engaging in the complex dynastic politics for which it was known, but treating it as a private theater. He organized elaborate feasts, not for diplomatic purposes, but to experience a cavalcade of new tastes. He commanded performances of musicians and dancers, his attention captured by the movement and the sound. The business of the empire was an irritating noise from a distant world. The reality was the feel of a sable fur against his skin, the scent of ambergris in a brazier, the sight of a jewel catching the light. This division of labor, however functional it appeared on the surface, was inherently unstable. It rested on the assumption that Ibrahim's passivity would be permanent. But while he had abdicated the responsibilities of power, he had not relinquished its prerogatives. He remained the Sultan, and any whim he chose to express was, by law, a divine command. The very success of the Grand Vizier's administration began to trigger the Sultan's deep-seated paranoia. Kara Mustafa Pasha's competence and high public profile were easily reframed as a threat by his many enemies at court. Rivals for his position, ambitious figures within the harem, and officials whose corrupt practices had been curtailed by his reforms, all found a receptive audience in the Sultan's ear. They whispered that the Grand Vizier was becoming too powerful, that he disdained the Sultan's authority, that he was, in effect, the true ruler of the empire. For a mind like Ibrahim's, which equated power not with responsibility but with the immediate gratification of desire, these accusations were potent. Kara Mustafa's fiscal austerity was an obstacle. When the Sultan demanded vast sums for a new jewel-encrusted canopy for his throne, or for a lavish redecoration of a harem apartment, the Grand Vizier would often delay or refuse, citing the needs of the state treasury. To Ibrahim, this was not a matter of responsible governance. It was an act of personal defiance, the confirmation of the whispers that the Vizier was usurping his power. The conflict came to a head in late 1643. The Sultan's paranoia, carefully stoked by the Vizier's enemies, now fully engulfed him. He became convinced that Kara Mustafa Pasha was plotting his deposition. On the 31st of January, 1644, Kara Mustafa Pasha was summoned to the palace, presented with his death sentence, and strangled in an antechamber. With his death, the last significant check on the Sultan's impulsive will was removed. The era of delegated, rational governance was over. The empire was now at the mercy of its masters' increasingly erratic and sensory-driven whims. The removal of Kara Mustafa Pasha created a void not only in the administration of the empire, but in the Sultan's own limited field of attention. With the austere and restraining figure of the Grand Vizier gone, there was no one left to deny the Sultan his whims, and more importantly, no one to distract him with the tedious business of state. His mind, unmoored from even the most superficial connection to governance, was now free to devote its entire energy to its own pathological compulsions. For Ibrahim, was not the ability to command armies or formulate laws. It was the absolute prerogative to reshape his immediate environment into a reflection of his internal, sensory-driven world. The court of the Ottoman Empire ceased to be a center of political gravity and began its transformation into a vast, opulent sensory apparatus designed for the sole comfort of its ruler. His first and most profound obsession was with scent. He developed a pathological fixation on ambergris, the rare and costly substance secreted by sperm whales, prized for its complex, musky aroma. His demand for it was insatiable. Braziers burning chunks of raw ambergris were kept lit day and night throughout his private apartments, filling the air with a thick, heavy perfume that clung to every surface. He commanded that his beard be perfumed with it, that his clothes be stored with it, and that it be mixed into the wax of the candles that lit his chambers. This was not merely an appreciation for refined scent. It was a desperate attempt to control his environment on a molecular level, to overwhelm the unpredictable stimuli of the world with a single constant and pleasant olfactory sensation. For a mind tormented by anxiety, this scented fog may have served as a form of psychological insulation. This preoccupation with the olfactory was soon matched by an equally powerful fixation on the tactile. Ibrahim became pathologically obsessed with furs, specifically the dark, exquisitely soft fur of the sable. His desire went far beyond personal adornment. He ordered entire suites of rooms in the palashings uncompletely lined, floor to ceiling with sable pelts. Historical accounts describe him spending hours in these fur-lined chambers, running his hands along the walls, lying on the fur-covered floors, deriving a palpable sense of common security from the constant, soft tactile input. The objective was not merely to wear the fur, but to inhabit an environment constructed from it, to create a sort of artificial womb that insulated him from the hard edges of reality. These compulsions precipitated a significant drain on the imperial exchequer. The acquisition of ambergris and sable pelts became a primary objective of the state. Imperial agents were dispatched to the farthest corners of the empire and beyond with one mission: to procure these luxury goods in unprecedented quantities. The fur markets of the north were scoured for the finest sable, with prices driven to astronomical levels by the Sultan's limitless demand. Ships were sent into the Indian Ocean on the remote chance of finding ambergris washed ashore. The costs were staggering. A single ounce of high-quality ambergris could be worth more than its weight in gold. The sheer volume of sable pelts required to panel a single room represented a fortune that could have funded a military regiment for a year. The court itself was remade to conform to these new priorities. Proximity to the Sultan and political influence were no longer determined by administrative competence or military prowess, but by one's ability to cater to his sensory obsessions. Courtiers who could procure a rare perfume, a unique textile, or an exceptionally fine piece of fur found themselves showered with favor and high office. Those who spoke of budgets or state necessities were dismissed as tiresome obstacles to the Sultan's comfort. The language of governance was replaced by the language of aesthetics. The critical question facing the Ottoman elite was no longer, is this policy wise? But will this texture please the Sultan? The state apparatus was being slowly, methodically repurposed, turned from an instrument of imperial power into a supply chain for the pathological appetites of a single, damaged man. The Sultan's quest for sensory gratification inevitably found its ultimate expression in the one domain where his power was most absolute and his privacy most complete: the imperial harem. Historically, the Ottoman harem was far more than the fantasyland of Western imagination. It was a complex and rigidly hierarchical institution, serving as the nucleus of dynastic reproduction and a formidable center of political power. It was the domain of the valid Sultan, who ruled it as an autonomous fiefdom within the palace. It was a school where women, sorts from across the empire and beyond, were educated in music, literature, and the intricate protocols of the court. It was a marriage market, where the Sultan's daughters and sisters were strategically wed to powerful Poles as to create and solidify political alliances. The harem was, in essence, the private face of the Ottoman state, governed by its own immutable laws and traditions, a place of immense discipline, subtle intrigue, and deadly seriousness. Under Ibrahim, this entire structure was systematically dismantled, not through a deliberate policy of reform, but through a profound and corrosive indifference to its purpose. He had no interest in the harem's political calculus, its educational mission, or its role in dynastic strategy. He viewed it simply as the largest and most readily available instrument for the satisfaction of his appetites. He treated its inhabitants not as potential consorts, political assets, or even as individuals, but as properties, living canvases upon which he could project his increasingly bizarre fantasies. The established hierarchy, meticulously maintained by his mother for decades, began to crumble under the weight of his impulsive whims. His sensory obsessions with texture and appearance were transferred directly onto the women of the court. He would spend hours directing their adornment, fixated on the specific weight of a brocade, the precise shade of a silk, or the way a string of pearls fell against the skin. He commanded that his concubines wear multiple layers of heavy, jewel-encrusted robes even in the heat of summer, seemingly deriving more satisfaction from the visual and tactile spectacle than from the women themselves. Chronicles record his fascination with mirrors. He had entire chambers lined with them, allowing him to observe these staged scenes from multiple angles, positioning himself as a spectator to his own life. This detachment is a recurring theme, suggesting a man incapable of genuine human connection, who could only engage with others as objects, within a tableau of his own creation. The harem's rigid social order was further destabilized by his erratic system of patronage. Traditionally, a concubine's status was elevated through a slow, formal process, culminating in bearing the sultan a son. Ibrahim ignored these protocols entirely. He would become infatuated with a low-ranking servant, a laundress, or a bath attendant, and overnight shower her with gifts, lands, and titles, elevating her above women who had spent years patiently navigating the harem's treacherous social ladder. This created intense jealousy and resentment, turning the ordered world of the harem into a chaotic free-for-all where favor was arbitrary and fleeting. One such favorite, a woman of Armenian origin whom Ibrahim named Sekrpr, or Sugar Cube, was granted such immense wealth and influence that she became a political power in her own right, much to the fury of the established court faction, including Qasem's sultan herself. Perhaps most illustrative of the harem's transformation into a private theater were the games the sultan was said to have invented. While some accounts are likely exaggerated by his enemies, they paint a consistent picture of profound psychological regression and dehumanization. In one infamous episode, he is said to have had his concubines stripped naked in the garden and instructed them to behave like mares in a field, while he, playing the part of a stallion, would run among them. These were not the actions of a decadent libertine, but of a mind that had lost its purchase on adulterality, retreating into a world of disturbing, infantile role-play. The imperial harem, once the very heart of Ottoman dynastic legitimacy, had become a stage for the pathologies of its master. Its purpose was no longer the creation of heirs, but the reenactment of a damaged man's fragmented fantasies. Within the transformed dominion of the harem, Ibrahim's generalized sensory compulsions began to crystallize into more specific and peculiar fixations. His attention, incapable of grasping abstract concepts of state, now focused with laser-like intensity on the physical forms of the women around him. But his criteria were not guided by the conventional aesthetics of Ottoman courtly beauty, which had long favored a graceful and delicate ideal. Ibrahim developed a pathological and obsessive preference for a very particular somatic type, women of immense physical proportions. This was not a mere preference, it became an imperial mandate, a quest that would divert the resources of the state and further illustrate the complete merger of his private pathology with public policy. The search was methodical and wide-ranging. Orders were dispatched from the capital to provincial governors and regional administrators across the vast expanse of the empire. Their instructions were explicit and unprecedented. Alongside their usual duties of tax collection, judicial administration, and maintaining public order, they were now tasked with a new, urgent priority to identify and procure the largest women within their jurisdictions. State agents, who would normally be engaged in espionage or diplomacy, were repurposed as scouts in this bizarre human survey. The criteria were based on pure physical mass. The Sultan, according to chroniclers, had become convinced that the ultimate sensual and comforting experience could only be provided by a consort of overwhelming corpulence. This imperial directive turned the traditional tribute of concubines into a grotesque competition. Governors eager to curry favor with the unpredictable monarch went to great lengths to find a candidate who would satisfy his unique tastes. The search extended into Armenia, Georgia, and the Caucasus regions long valued as sources for the imperial harem, but the criteria had been fundamentally altered. The women identified were not captives of war in the traditional sense, they were acquisitions. Specimens sought to satisfy a specific and clinical fetish. Their journey to Constantinople was not that of a common slave, but of a prized and delicate commodity, transported with care and expense to be presented at the palace. The most famous and well-documented product of this search was a woman of Armenian origin, who upon her arrival in the harem was given the name Saif Sultan. She was reportedly of such a scale that she perfectly embodied the Sultan's obsessive ideal. Ibrahim's reaction to her presentation was one of immediate and total infatuation. He was mesmerized. He lavished upon her the title of Hosek-I Sultan, a rank reserved for the most favored consorts, immediately elevating her over women of far more senior standing and political connection. This act alone sent shockwaves through the established harem hierarchy, breeding intense resentment among the other concubines and, most notably, the Sultan's own mother. But the elevation in status was accompanied by an allocation of wealth that was, even by the extravagant standards of the Ottoman court, breathtakingly irresponsible. Ibrahim, in a fit of adoration, granted Saif Sultan the entire annual tax revenue of the province of Damascus, one of the wealthiest and most important regions of the empire. This was not a stipend, it was the wholesale privatization of a major state income stream, diverted to the personal account of a single. The act was a fiscal catastrophe and a political scandal. It demonstrated to the ruling elite that the Sultan's whims were no longer confined to the palace walls. They could now directly dismantle the financial architecture of the state. This fixation on form was more than a mere sexual idiosyncrasy. It was a clear symptom of his deeply damaged psychology. For a man defined by a lifetime of fear and helplessness, the physical immensity of these women may have represented a source of maternal comfort and security, a living shield against his anxieties. Their size made them a dominant sensory input, a tangible, overwhelming presence that could silence the noise inside his own head. He was not seeking an object, a piece of living architecture that could make him feel safe. The search for the largest woman in the empire was, in reality, a desperate and pathological search for a sanctuary. The Sultan's psychological retreat into a world of sensory comfort was paralleled by a profound vulnerability to forces that promised relief from his internal torments. His chronic, debilitating headaches and persistent anxiety were not just character flaws, they were physical manifestations of his mental conditions. The court's most learned physicians, trained in the formal medical traditions of the time, were powerless to treat these ailments. Their remedies, based on the Galenic theory of humus, offered no relief to a man whose suffering was rooted into decades of psychological abuse. This failure of established science and reason created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped a man who offered a different kind of cure, one tailored not to the body, but to the Sultan's deeply superstitious soul. His name was Abazaid Hussein Effendi, but he would become known to history by his far more evocative moniker, Sinsi Hokai, the master of decay inns. He was not a member of the high clergy or a respected scholar from a major madrasa. He was a provincial mystic, a practitioner of folk Islam who had gained a local reputation as a healer and an exorcist. His methods were not those of the physician, but of the shaman. He dealt in amulets, talismans, numerology, and the recitation of sacred verses to ward off evil spirits, which he claimed were the true source of all affliction. He was, by the standards of the educated Ottoman elite, a charlatan. But to a man like Ibrahim, who lacked the intellectual framework to distinguish between science and superstition, his claims were entirely plausible. In a moment of desperation, as the Sultan lay incapacitated by one of his severe headaches, Sinsi Hokai was summoned to the palace. Where the court doctors had seen a physiological imbalance, he saw a spiritual affliction. He did not administer potions. He performed rituals. He wrote Quranic verses on slips of paper and had the sultan swallow them. He created intricate talismans to be worn on the sultan's body. He burned incenses not for their scent, but to drive away malevolent DJ-ins. He chanted prayers over the sultan, his voice a low, hypnotic drone. By a combination of psychosomatic suggestion, coincidence, and the sheer force of his own charismatic confidence, a temporary remission of the sultan's symptoms occurred. To Ibrahim, it was nothing short of a miracle. He had found his savior. He quickly learned to monetize the spiritual capital. Officials seeking an appointment, petitioners with a grievance, or pausers hoping for a promotion discovered that the direct path to the sultan was now closed. The new gatekeeper was Sinsi Hoke. A gift to the holy man would ensure that a petition was presented on an auspicious day, accompanied by a favorable spiritual forecast. To ignore him was to risk having one's case dismissed as spiritually tainted or ill-omened. He amassed a personal fortune of staggering proportions, his provincial home replaced by a lavish palace built with the proceeds of his influence peddling. The apex of his power came when Ibrahim, in a display of ultimate gratitude, decided to grant his mystic healer a formal position in the state hierarchy. He was appointed Qazi Asker, or chief judge, of Anatolia. This was one of the highest judicial and religious posts in the empire, a position that required decades of distinguished scholarship and legal practice. The appointment of a self-proclaimed jinn master to this office was a profound scandal. It was a direct assault on the integrity of the Ummah, the established class of religious scholars and jurists who had for centuries been the bedrock of Ottoman legitimacy. They were horrified and humiliated but powerless to oppose the Sultan's will. The rise of Sinsi Hoke was complete. A provincial charlatan now controlled a significant portion of the empire's judicial system. His power derived not from law or learning, but from his skillful exploitation of a broken man's fears. With the execution of Kara Mustafa Pasha, the final structural impediment to the Sultan's will was removed. His replacement as Grand Vizier, Sultan Zaid Mehmed Pasha, was a man chosen precisely for his plis. He was a courtier, not a statesman, and he understood that his primary duty was not to govern the empire but to facilitate the monarch's desires. The office of the Grand Vizier, for centuries the administrative engine of the Ottoman state, was thus effectively neutered, transformed into the highest-ranking clerical position in the Sultan's personal service. The Divan, the Imperial Council, ceased to be a forum for policy debate and became a stage for a ritualized and deeply anxious form of consensus building, where the Vizier's primary task was to divine the Sultan's fleeting mood before offering an opinion. Administration was no longer a process. It was a series of disconnected impulses. The logic of statecraft was replaced by the chaotic internal logic of Ibrahim's own mind. High offices were filled and vacated with bewildering speed, based on criteria that had no connection to merit or experience. A provincial governor might be appointed because he sent a gift of particularly sweet melons that pleased the Sultan's palate. A fleet admiral could be dismissed because the Sultan disliked the color of his turban during a ceremonial review. Historical records from the period are filled with accounts of competent and experienced officials being summarily executed for reasons that were either trivial or entirely opaque, their deaths serving as a stark reminder to the rest of the elite that survival depended not on performance, but on remaining invisible or unfailingly pleasing. Power within the court coalesced around the small group of individuals who had mastered the art of managing the Sultan's temperament. His mother, Qasem Sultan, still wielded immense influence, but she was now forced to compete with the rising stars of Ibrahim's own making, his favorite concubines, particularly the formidable Saif Kaya and the ever-present mystic Sinsi Hoke. This informal triumvirate became the true locus of power. A petition's success, a candidate's promotion, or a pasha's disgrace depended on which of these figures one could successfully lobby. The result was an administrative civil war fought with whispers, bribes, and carefully deployed flattery. The machinery of government ground to a near halt, paralyzed by the conflicting signals emanating from the palace's inner sanctumess. The degradation of public office was stark. In a particularly telling episode, the Sultan, feeling unwell during a meal, commanded his Grand Vizier to personally hold the basin for him. The supreme minister of the empire was reduced to the status of a menial servant, a public humiliation that symbolized the complete collapse of the traditional dignities of office. On other occasions, Ibrahim would bestow the highest titles of the state upon his court jesters and dwarfs as a form of private amusement, creating a pasha of tobacco or a governor of the royal pantry. While these may have been intended as jokes, they had a profoundly corrosive effect on the prestige of the very titles that held the imperial hierarchy together. If the title of pasha could be given to a court fool, its value when held by a genuine general or governor was inherently diminished. This impulsive style of rule had devastating economic consequences. State revenues were treated as the Sultan's personal petty cash. He would grant tax farms, entire villages, or the customs duties of a major port to a favorite courtier on a whim, with no thought to the long-term impact on the treasury. His demands for luxury goods continued unabated, and the state's resources were increasingly diverted to satisfy them. This erratus, uncertain of who was in favor at court, resorted to increasingly brutal and corrupt methods to extract wealth, hedging against their own potential and sudden downfall. The intricate, centuries-old system of Ottoman bureaucracy began to unravel, not from external attack, but from the sheer irrationality at its center. The Sultan's mind, the chaotic landscape of fleeting desires and anxieties, was being projected onto the empire itself, remaking it in its own disordered image. And it was only a matter of time before a decision made from this state of profound impulse would precipitate a crisis far too large to be contained within the palace walls. The Eastern Mediterranean in the mid-17th century was a space of negotiated coexistence between the two dominant maritime powers, the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Venice. There was a long and complex history of rivalry, punctuated by brutal wars and lucrative periods of trade. By the 1642s, a fragile peace held, governed by treaties and the mutual understanding that an all-out conflict was ruinously expensive for both sides. This delicate balance, however, was predicated on the assumption of rational actors on both sides of the Adriatic. It was not built to withstand the kind of unreasoning, impulsive force that now occupied the Ottoman throne. As the flotilla sailed north, it was intercepted by a squadron of 6 galleys under the command of the Knights of St. John, based on the island of Malta. This Catholic military order operated as a semi-independent entity whose primary function was a state of perpetual religiously sanctioned maritime conflict with Muslim powers. For them, any Ottoman vessel was a legitimate target. The ensuing battle was brief and one-sided. The Ottoman ships were captured, their valuable cargo seized, and their high-ranking passengers taken prisoner. The knights, rather than returning directly to Malta, sailed to the southern coast of Crete, a Venetian possession, where they put in at a small port to take on supplies and make repairs. After a short stay, they departed for Malta with their prize. The news of this incident reached the Topkapi Palace and was received by the Sultan, not as a geopolitical complication, but as a profound personal violation. The capture of a ship carrying a member of his extended household and a former, high-ranking palace official was an intolerable affront to his personal honor. The fact that the act was committed by the Knights of Malta, the perennial Christian corsairs, was secondary. The critical detail, in Ibrahim's mind, was that the perpetrators had found safe harbor, however briefly, on Venetian territory. His rage was immediate, volcanic, and entirely devoid of political calculation. He did not distinguish between the actions of the knights and the passive complicity of the Venetians. In his disordered perception, they were one and the same. The Venetian Republic's diplomatic representatives in Istanbul were summoned. They vehemently protested their innocence, arguing correctly that they had no control over the Knights of Malta, that offering temporary port access for humanitarian reasons was standard maritime custom. They offered apologies and sought to de-escalate the crisis. But they were attempting to apply logic and diplomacy to a situation that was being governed by pure, unmediated emotion. In his view, the sanctity of his household had been violated, and the stain of that violation now lay upon the Venetian island of Crete. His viziers, products of a more traditional uncautious school of statecraft, likely advised restraint. A war with Venice would be a massive undertaking, requiring the mobilization of the empire's full naval and military resources. It would be a long, costly, and unpredictable affair. But their counsel was swept aside by the sheer force of the Sultan's fury, which was amplified by the war hawks at court who saw an opportunity for glory and plunder. Venice would be punished. The entire Ottoman war machine was to be mobilized. The target was to be Crete. The objective was punitive, not strategic. It was an act of rage, not upon a siege of the 17th century. The Cretan war, a conflict that would last for 24 years and bleed the treasuries of both powers dry, was initiated not by a council of war weighing strategic imperatives, but as a direct therapeutic response to the wounded ego of a single, unstable monarch. The declaration of war against the Venetian Republic was not merely a military or diplomatic event. It was a fiscal one of the first magnitude. A major amphibious campaign, conducted across a significant maritime distance, represented the single most expensive undertaking a 17th century state could attempt. It required the construction of new warships, the extensive refitting of existing ones, the procurement of vast quantities of naval stores, timber, rope, canvas, pitch, and the production of immense stockpiles of gunpowder and cannonballs. Most critically, it required cash. Tens of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and oarsmen had to be paid their salaries in sound currency, an unnegotiable prerequisite for maintaining discipline and morale on a long campaign. For a state to succeed in such a venture, it needed a full treasury, disciplined fiscal management, and a ruler committed to prioritizing the needs of the war effort. Had none of these, the imperial treasury was now subjected to a ruinous front assault. From one side, it was being drained by the legitimate and ever-growing costs of the Cretan expedition. From the other, it was being plundered by the insatiable and entirely non-negotiable demands of the Sultan's personal obsessions. The war effort and the Sultan's private manias were placed in direct competition for the same limited pool of state resources, and in the court of Ibrahim I, the needs of the latter almost always took precedence. While the Kopudin Pasha, the Grand Admiral of the fleet, was petitioning the Divan for funds to repair his galleys, the Sultan was issuing decrees for the acquisition of sable pelts on a scale that dwarfed all previous records. The obsession with sable fur now metastasized from a personal eccentricity into a significant driver of state policy. The project to line the imperial apartments with fur was not abandoned in the face of war. It was accelerated. Imperial decrees demanded that the walls, ceilings, and in some accounts, even the floors of entire suites in the Topkapi Palace be covered. This was an enterprise of almost unimaginable expense. The finest Russian sable was one of the most prized luxury commodities in the world, and the Sultan's agents, armed with the full faith and credit of the imperial treasury, cornered the market, driving prices to astronomical new heights. Funds that had been earmarked for military payrolls or the purchase of grain for the army were frequently reappropriated by direct imperial order and paid out to fur merchants. This was compounded by his unceasing demand for jewels and opulent objects. He commissioned a new imperial carriage, so heavily encrusted with gold and precious stones that its utility as a vehicle was secondary to its function as a mobile treasury. He took to showering his favorite concubines with handfuls of jewels and gold coins, a practice that provided a moment of amusement but represented a direct and irreversible drain of bullion from the state's reserves. The workshops of the palace jewelers and goldsmiths were kept in constant operation, consuming vast quantities of raw materials to produce an endless stream of luxurious trifles, while the imperial mint struggled to find enough silver to strike the AKCS needed to pay the janissaries fighting and dying in the trenches before the Venetian fortress of Candia. The inevitable result was a rapid and catastrophic depletion of the imperial reserves. The treasury, which had been painstakingly refilled by the austere measures of Muradivi and Kerem Mustafa Pasha, was emptied. Faced with a looming state bankruptcy, the new Grand Vizier and his officials resorted to the desperate official measures of a failing administration. They began by systematically eating the estates of wealthy officials, often after having them executed on fabricated charges. This created a reign of terror among the elite, but it was a short-term solution that destroyed confidence in the state. Next, they ordered the debasement of the currency, reducing the silver content of the coinage. This allowed the mint to produce more coins from the same amount of bullion, but it was a hidden axe that immediately led to rampant inflation, eroding the purchasing power of soldiers and commoners alike. Finally, the state imposed a series of extraordinary and punitive taxes, forced loans levied on merchants, artisans, and religious foundations, stifling the empire's economic life. The Ottoman state was beginning to consume itself. Its long-term financial health sacrificed to fund a brutal war broadened a pathological fantasy at home. The official hemorrhaging of the empire did not go unnoticed by its most seasoned political observer, Qasem Sultan. From her powerful position as Valide Sultan, she possessed a panoramic view of the state's health, informed by a network of loyal officials and a lifetime of experience in the mechanics of power. She saw the reports from the treasury, she heard the discontent from the military commanders in Crete, and she understood, with a clarity that eluded everyone else in the Sultan's inner circle, that the current trajectory was unsustainable. The combination of a ruinous war and a profligate monarch was a formula for dynastic collapse. For her, this was not an abstract problem of statecraft, it was an existential threat to the legacy she had spent her life building and the future of the dynasty she embodied. She began to intervene. Initially, her efforts were subtle, operating through the established channels of influence she had long mastered. She would quietly counsel the Grand Vizier to delay the fulfillment of her son's more outrageous financial demands. She used her authority within the harem to attempt to curtail the influence of the newer favorites, reasserting the traditional protocols and hierarchies that Ibrahim's whims had shattered. She tried to reason with her son directly, appealing to him in the private, maternal register that had once been the only source of comfort in his life. She framed her concerns in the language of dynastic security and imperial majesty, hoping to guide his spending toward more conventional and less destructive forms of royal display. To Ibrahim, however, this counsel was not perceived as prudent advice. It was interpreted as a direct and intolerable challenge to his autonomy. His entire adult identity, fragile as it was built upon his status as the absolute, unquestionable sultan. His mother's attempts to impose limits, no matter how gently phrased, were a regression to the power dynamics of the Kafes, a reminder of a time when he was helpless and controlled. His deepest psychological wound was the terror of being powerless, and he reacted to any perceived constraint with the disproportionate fury of a cornered animal. This growing rift between mother and son was expertly exploited by the coalition of individuals whose power depended entirely on the sultan's continued indulgence. Since Ihoke, the mystic, Sekeopr and Saivkar, the favored concubines, and a host of other sycophants and opportunists saw Qasem as the primary obstacle to their own ambitions. She was the voice of tradition, austerity, and reason, the very forces that threatened their parasitic relationship with the sultan. They began a systematic campaign of insinuation, a constant whispering in the sultan's ear that his own mother was plotting against him. They reframed her every action through the lens of his paranoia. Her concern for the treasury was presented as an attempt to limit his power. Her management of the harem was a scheme to undermine his authority. Her private counsel was a sign of her contempt for his ability to rule. In a fit of rage, he made a decision that was both symbolic and politically seismic. He stripped his mother of her titles and wealth and banished her from the Topkapi palace. She was exiled to the old palace, the traditional, honorable, but politically impotent residence of the consorts of deceased sultans. With this single decree, he had decapitated the most stable and experienced political faction at court. He followed this by seizing the vast estates of his own sisters and nieces, allies of his mother, and granting them to his favorite concubines. The act was a declaration of independence, a final, brutal severing of the ties that had bound him to his family and to the traditions of the state. By exiling the one person who had both the power and the motive to save the dynasty from his excesses, Ibrahim had cut the final break line. The court was now entirely his creation. A hermetically sealed echo chamber populated only by those who profited from his madness. With the court thus purged of all dissenting voices, the final insulation between the sultan's psyche and the state was gone. The palace became a perfect echo chamber, a closed system in which the only permissible reality was the one defined by Ibrahim's immediate desires. The small cabal of favorites who had orchestrated Qasem's removal now held unchecked power, but it was a precarious authority, entirely dependent on their ability to anticipate and satisfy the ever-shifting whims of their master. Their primary function was no longer to govern, but to facilitate fantasy. And the Sultan's most potent and expensive fantasy remained his obsession with the tactile sensation of sable fur. The ongoing war in Crete had already pushed the imperial finances to the brink of collapse. The treasury was empty, the traditional sources of revenue, agricultural taxes, customs duties, and the income from state-owned lands were already strained to their absolute limit. Yet, the Sultan's demand for sable did not diminish, it intensified. The project to panel his apartments in fur was his singular preoccupation, and its incompletion was a source of constant, irritable agitation. His facilitators were thus presented with an impossible problem: how to fund an infinitely expensive obsession with a finite and rapidly dwindling pool of resources. The solution they devised was a testament to both their desperation and their profound disconnect from the social and political realities of the empire. A normal administration, faced with such a deficit, would have attempted to raise funds by arguing for the necessities of the state, primarily the war effort. But this was not a normal administration, and the funds were not for a recognizable state purpose. Therefore, the Grand Vizier, Ahmed Pasha, with the encouragement of Sinsi Hakai and their harem favorites, proposed a new, extraordinary levy. It was not to be a tax for the army, or for the fleet, or for the administration. It was to be a tax explicitly for the acquisition of sable. This sable tax, as it became known, was a fiscal and political aberration of the highest order. It was a direct command for the subjects of the empire to personally fund the Sultan's private compulsion. The decree was promulgated across the empire, imposing a forced contribution on every high-ranking official, every provincial governor, every wealthy merchant, and every senior member of the Ulama, the Islamic scholarly class. The levy was not progressive or standardized. The amounts demanded were often arbitrary, based on the perceived wealth of the individual. In effect, it was a form of mass extortion, sanctioned by the highest authority in the land. The reaction to the tax was one of uniform shock and revulsion. For the military and bureaucratic classes, who were already suffering from delayed salaries and the general chaos of the administration, it was a profound insult. They were being asked to sacrifice their personal wealth, not for the glory of the empire, but for the decoration of the Sultan's bedchamber. For the merchant class, it was a ruinous imposition, a direct confiscation of capital that threatened to bankrupt their enterprises. But the most significant opposition came from the ulama. According to Islamic law, a ruler had the right to levy taxes for the legitimate functions of the state, such as defense and justice. However, levying a tax for personal luxury was considered fundamentally illegitimate, an act of tyranny that violated the sacred trust between the ruler and his people. The sable tax was not just financially punitive, it was an offense against God's law. Despite the widespread and simmering outrage, the tax was collected with ruthless efficiency. The Sultan's will was absolute, and the officials tasked with its collection knew that failure would be met with swift and lethal punishment. The wealth of the empire's cities was siphoned toward the capital, where it was immediately dispersed to fur traders. The political cost of this measure was catastrophic. It united previously disparate and oft unrivalrous factions in a shared sense of grievance against the throne. The janissary in the barracks, the merchant in his counting house, and the cleric in his mosque were now bound by a common enemy, a sultan whose madness was no longer a palace secret, but a direct and predatory assault on their property and principles. By attempting to sheathe his private rooms in the softest of furs, Ibrahim had wrapped his entire regime in the coarse and abrasive fabric of public hatred. The foundations of his rule, already cracked, were beginning to crumble. The Sultan's mental state, now unbuffeted by any restraining influence, continued its inexorable decline. His behavior grew more erratic, his rages more frequent, and his detachment from reality more profound. The harem, his private kingdom, became the primary stage for this final unraveling. It was here in this closed and claustrophobic world that the most notorious and debated instant of his reign is alleged to have occurred. Some contemporary accounts are silent on the matter, while others, often written by his political enemies after his fall, describe it in lurid detail. The event is the alleged mass drowning of the imperial harem. According to the most dramatic of these accounts, the catalyst was a minor breach of protocol that Ibrahim's paranoid mind magnified into a full-blown conspiracy. He came to believe that one of his concubines had been unfaithful, that a male intruder had somehow penetrated the sanctum of the harem. He launched a furious investigation, subjecting the women and the eunuchs who guarded them to interrogation and torture. But the investigation yielded no culprit, a fact that only deepened his suspicion. His paranoia, unable to fixate on a single guilty party, expanded to encompass the entire institution. If one of them was treacherous, then they were all potentially treacherous. They were a collective source of anxiety, a constant, unknowable threat within the very heart of his sanctuary. His solution, as recorded by the chronicler Naima and others, was one of absolute and terrifying finality. He is said to have ordered his chief executioners to gather all 280 women of his harem, with the sole exception of his favorite Hosek sultans. They were to be bound, placed into weighted sacks, and loaded onto boats. The small flotilla then rowed out into the middle of the Bosporus, the strait of water that flows through the heart of Istanbul. There, on the Sultan's command, the sacks containing the living women were thrown overboard. The story presents a scene of methodical, state-sanctioned mass murder, a silent and horrific purge conducted under the cloak of night. It is crucial to approach this account with a degree of critical analysis. The act, as described, is one of such monstrous extremity that it borders on the theatrical. It is possible that the story was a later invention or a gross exaggeration, a piece of black propaganda designed to retroactively justify the Sultan's deposition and execution. No regime is more eager to document the crimes of its predecessor than the one that has just overthrown it. A story like this served to frame Ibrahim not merely as an incompetent ruler, but as an inhuman monster, making his removal an act of public salvation. However, even if the event did not happen exactly as described, the fact that the story was told and, more importantly, that it was widely believed is itself a significant historical datum. It reflects the atmosphere of the court at the time. The Sultan's behavior had become so unpredictable, his rages so violent, and his decrees so divorced from reason, that an act of this scale was considered plausible by his contemporaries. The story, whether fact or fiction, was consistent with the known psychological profile of a man who had repeatedly demonstrated a profound lack of empathy, an inability to see other human beings as anything more than objects for his use or disposal. A more moderate interpretation of the event, favored by some historians, suggests that the incident may have been a more limited punitive action against a small number of concubines accused of a specific transgression, which was then inflated by rumor into a wholesale massacre. Another possibility is that the story is an allegorical representation of the Sultan's general cruelty and his destructive impact on the harem as an institution. He was, in a very real sense, drowning its traditions, its hierarchies, and its political function under the weight of his own pathologies. Regardless of its literal truth, the incident at the Bosporus became a cornerstone of the case against Ibrahim. It was the ultimate symbol of his madness, a ruler who had turned his life-giving harem, the very source of his dynasty's future, into a watery grave. It was an act of dynastic suicide that no state could long endure. As the empire buckled under the combined weight of war, corruption, and ruinous taxation, the Sultan's attention fixated on a project that seemed to encapsulate his complete and total detachment from the suffering of his subjects. This was the marriage of his infant daughter, Fatma Sultan. Royal weddings were traditionally grand affairs in the Ottoman court, designed to project the wealth and power of the dynasty. The scale and extravagance of the ceremony Ibrahim planned went far beyond any established precedent. It was not to be a celebration of a dynastic alliance, but a public performance of his own private fantasy, funded by a state that was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The bride, his daughter, was a toddler, barely 4 years old. The groom chosen for this political charade was the powerful Pasha, Musa Hip Yusuf, a man already in his 50s. The marriage was purely symbolic, a political gesture intended to bind the powerful official to the Sultan's household. But Ibrahim obsessed over the ceremonial details with the same pathological intensity he applied to his sable furs and perfumes. The wedding was to be the most magnificent spectacle the city of Istanbul had ever witnessed, a theatrical production designed to awe and overwhelm the senses. The preparations themselves became a national crisis. The Sultan commanded that the entire city be decorated. The shops of the Grand Bazaar were to be draped in priceless silks and brocades. The streets along the procession route were to be covered in flowers. He ordered the construction of enormous, elaborate float sugar sculptures depicting castles, mythical animals, and entire gardens to be paraded through the city. These were not merely decorations. They were vast, ephemeral monuments, built at enormous cost in both materials and skilled labor, destined to be consumed or discarded after a single day's use. The confectioners and artisans of the capital were conscripted into this massive effort, their normal commerce completely disrupted. The most egregious aspect of the celebration was its direct financial cost. Ibrahim demanded that the dowry for his infant daughter be the most lavish in the history of the dynasty. The imperial workshops were stripped of their reserves of gold, silver, and precious stones to create an endless stream of gifts, jewel-encrusted furniture, robes woven with gold thread, harnesses for horses studded with diamonds and emerald. Chronicles described the treasure being piled on 200s of mules for the ceremonial procession from the Topkapi Palace to the groom's residence. This was not state wealth being displayed, it was state wealth being liquidated and given away, a one-time, irreversible transfer of capital from the public treasury to a private individual. To the general populace of Istanbul, this spectacle was not a source of joy or civic pride, it was a bitter and infuriating insult. The city was in the grip of a severe economic crisis, driven by the debasement of the currency and the massive war taxes. The price of bread, the staple food of the urban poor, had skyrocketed. The families of the Janissaries, fighting in Crete, were struggling to survive on devalued and intermittently paid salaries. Into this environment of widespread public misery, the Sultan injected a spectacle of almost obscene opulence. The sight of the endless procession of treasure being paraded through the streets for a sham wedding did not inspire awe. It inspired a deep and burning resentment. It was a tangible, unavoidable demonstration of the vast gulf that separated the ruler's fantasy world from the harsh reality of his subjects' life. This event proved to be a critical turning point in public opinion. The Sultan's madness, which had previously been a concern primarily for the ruling elite, was now a matter of public scandal and outrage. The story of the infant's wedding spread through the coffee houses and marketplaces, becoming a symbol of the regime's corruption and moral bankruptcy. It was an act of such profound political tone-deafness that it served to galvanize the disparate threads of discontent into a coherent narrative of misrule. The people, the army, and the clergy now had a common focus for their anger. The wedding of Fatma Sultan was meant to be a celebration of the dynasty's power, but it served instead as the final, public announcement of its utter decay. The opulent and deeply inappropriate wedding of the infant princess was not the cause of the regime's collapse, but rather the final, public symptom of its terminal disease. The simmering discontent that had been compartmentalized within the various sectors of Ottoman society now coalesced into a single, unified body of outrage. The spectacle had provided a common grievance, a shared narrative of a throne occupied not just by an incompetent, but by a tyrant whose pathologies were actively preying upon the state. In the barracks of the Janissaries, the chancel areas of the bureaucracy, and the quiet courtyards of the mosques, the same conversations were now taking place. The whispers of private frustration were hardening into the vocabulary of conspiracy. The coalition that began to form in the summer of 1648 was one of the dispossessed, a union of factions who, despite their often conflicting interests, now shared a singular objective: the removal of Sultan Ibrahim. The first and most critical component of this alliance was the military, specifically the Janissary Corps and their commanders. Their grievances were the most immediate and visceral. The Cretan War had become a bloody, attritional stalemate, consuming men and materiel with no decisive victory in sight. Their pay was consistently in arrears, and when it did arrive, it was in debased coinage that bought their families less and less food in the marketplace. They were being asked to die for a state that seemed indifferent to their sacrifice, their hardship made all the more insulting by the constant news of the Sultan's extravagant follies. The Aga of the Janissaries, the Corps Supreme Commander, found it increasingly difficult to maintain discipline among troops who felt betrayed by their sovereign. The second pillar of the conspiracy was the Ulema, the clerical and judicial establishment, whose spiritual and legal authority formed the ideological bedrock of the Ottoman state. Their opposition was not rooted in finance, but in principle. They viewed Ibrahim's reign as a succession of violations against the holy law of Islam, the Sharia. The appointment of the charlatan Sinsi Hoke to a high judicial post was an unforgivable corruption of their order. The imposition of the sable tax was an illegal confiscation of property. The Sultan's general conduct, his cruelty, his sexual excesses, his flagrant disregard for justice and tradition marked him as an unjust ruler, a tyrant who had forfeited his right to command the allegiance of the faithful. For the Syhul Islam, the highest religious authority in the empire, the situation was becoming a crisis of conscience. His office carried the sacred duty to uphold the law, even against the Sultan himself. The third element of the emerging plot was the state bureaucracy itself, the viziers and paw's of the imperial divan. These were men who had risen through a system that, for all its flaws, was built on a foundation of protocol and rational self-interest. Ibrahim's rule had replaced this system with pure caprice. They lived in a state of constant, debilitating fear, aware that their lives and fortunes depended on the monarch's mood. As the fate of Kara Mustafa Pasha had shown, it could be a death sentence. They watched as the administrative and fiscal structures of the empire were systematically dismantled to serve the Sultan's whims. Their loyalty to the institution of the Sultanate was now in direct conflict with their loyalty to the person of the Sultan. For the Grand Vizier Ahmed Pasha, the calculus was becoming brutally simple. He could either preside over the complete disintegration of the state or take the unimaginably dangerous step of moving against its master. These three power blocks began to communicate through a series of clandestine meetings. The Grand Vizier, risking his own life, made contact with the leaders of the Janissaries and key figures within the Ummah. The central node in this web of conspiracy, however, was not in the Topkapi Palace, but in the Old Palace, where Qasim Sultan resided in her enforced exile. The plotters understood that for their actions to have any semblance of legitimacy, they needed the sanction of the dynasty itself. They required a viable successor, and the obvious candidate was Ibrahim's eldest son, the 6-year-old Prince Mehmed. And Mehmed's political guardian was his grandmother. Her support was not difficult to obtain. She saw the existential threat her son posed to the dynasty. By sacrificing Ibrahim, she could save the lineage, installing a child sultan and resuming the regency she had been forced to relinquish. It was a cold, unsentimental, but politically necessary calculation. The conspiracy now had its components: the military muscle of the Janissaries, the moral justification of the clergy, the administrative machinery of the viziers, and the dynastic legitimacy of the Validi Sultan. The decision was made. The Sultan had to be removed. The conspiracy, having consolidated its key players, now required one final, indispensable element, a formal instrument of legitimacy. A coup d'etat based on military force alone would be seen as a mere rebellion, a mutiny that could easily spiral into civil war. To depose the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth, was an act of profound gravity, bordering on sacrilege. For the deposition to be accepted as a lawful and necessary act of state, it had to be sanctioned by the highest authority on Islamic jurisprudence, the Syhul Islam. The plotters needed more than just a political consensus, they needed a fatwa. A fatwa is a legal opinion or ruling issued by a recognized Islamic scholar. In the Ottoman system, the fatwa from the Syhul Islam on a matter of state had immense, almost binding, authority. It was the mechanism by which the actions of the Sultan could be judged against the divine template of the Sharia. The conspirators, led by the Grand Vizier Ahmed Pasha, formally presented their case to the incumbent Syhul Islam. The meeting was not a debate. It was a carefully choreographed legal proceeding, the outcome of which had already been determined by the political realities. The Grand Vizier and the other senior paw's has laid out the indictment against Sultan Ibrahim. They did not frame their arguments in terms of personal grievance or political disagreement. Instead, they meticulously detailed the Sultan's public violations of Islamic law and his failure to perform the essential duties of a caliph. The charges were specific and damning. They cited his squandering of the public treasury on personal luxuries while the state was engaged in a holy war, a clear dereliction of his duty as commander of the faithful. They referenced his appointment of corrupt and unqualified individuals, like Sinsi Hoke, to positions of high religious and judicial trust, thereby undermining the administration of justice. They spoke of his unjust executions of blameless officials and the confiscation of private property without due process, as exemplified by the sable tax. They described his neglect of the divan and his complete abdication of the responsibilities of governance, leaving the state rudderless and adrift. The core of their legal argument rested on a fundamental principle of Islamic political theory. A ruler who is mentally incapable of distinguishing right from wrong or of managing the affairs of the Muslim community is not fit to rule. The Sultan's well-known madness, which had long been a whispered secret of the court, was now presented as a legal fact. He was, they argued, a ruler in name only. His mind clouded to the point where he could no longer fulfill the sacred contract between sovereign and subject. The Syhul Islam listened to this litany of abuses. His role was not to investigate the factual truth of each claim. The facts were by now a matter of public knowledge and universal consensus among the elite. His role was to answer a specific, carefully worded legal question. The conspirators posed it to him in the formal, hypothetical language required for a fatwa. If a ruler is mad, a spendthrift, and a violator of the sacred law, and his continued rule is detrimental to the well-being of the believers and the state, is it permissible under the law to depose him? With the legal and moral authority of the fatwa secured, the conspiracy transitioned from a clandestine enterprise into a formal act of state. The operation to depose the Sultan was scheduled for the early morning of the 8th of August, 1648. The timing was deliberate, chosen to take advantage of the quiet and to ensure that the levers of power could be seized before the palace was fully active. The execution was not to be a chaotic mob action, but a swift, methodical, and overwhelmingly decisive display of the state's collective will. The first move was made by the Janissaries. In the darkness, regiments loyal to the Aga marched not upon the palace, but to the great mosques of the city, the Sultan Ahmed Mosque and the Hagia Sophia. They were not there to riot, but to assemble and to demonstrate their support for the Ulma. This was a critical piece of political theatre. It signaled that the army was not acting on its own behalf, but as the enforcement arm of the sacred law. Simultaneously, other units, under the command of the Grand Vizier's loyalists, moved to secure the key strategic points of the capital, the armory, the mint, and the main city gates. News of the unfolding events reached the Sultan within his private apartments. The unusual pre-dawn activity, the sound of marching troops, and the sudden, tense silence that followed would have triggered every nerve in his paranoid psyche. He was not, however, immediately confronted. The conspirators first moved to secure the person of the heir, 6-year-old Prince Mehmed. The child was taken from his chambers and brought to the throne room, where the assembled dignitaries immediately performed the act of homage, acclaiming him as Sultan Mehmed IV. With this single decisive act, the legal transfer of power was complete. Ibrahim was no longer the Sultan, he was the former Sultan, a private citizen stripped of all divine and legal protection. Only then did the delegation proceed to Ibrahim's quarters to inform him of his deposition. The confrontation was not a negotiation, it was the delivery of a verdict. Ibrahim, who had barricaded himself inside, was met not with violence, but with the cold, unassailable logic of the new political reality. The Grand Vizier and the Syhul Islam stood before his door. They read aloud the charges that had been presented in the text of the fatwa that had sealed his fate. Ibrahim's reaction was a predictable explosion of impotent fury. He shouted threats reminding them of his absolute power, a power he no longer possessed. He hurled abuse, calling them traitors and infidels. When the rage subsided, it was replaced by a panicked, desperate pleading. According to the chronicles, he directed his pleas to the Syhul Islam, the one man whose authority he seemed to dimly recognize as being outside his own. "Is it your command that I be deposed?" he cried. The Syhul Islam's reply was a masterpiece of legalistic finality. "You have squandered the resources of the state, and your misrule has brought the empire to the brink of ruin." The door was then forced open. Ibrahim, seeing the grim faces of the viziers and the armed guards behind them, finally understood that the game was over. His body seemed to collapse, the manic energy draining away to be replaced by a whimpering terror. He was seized, his lavish robes stripped from him. He was no longer a monarch, but a prisoner. The vizier debated his fate. Some argued for immediate execution, but the prevailing view, likely advanced by Qasim Sultan from afar, was to follow the precedent that had defined Ibrahim's own life. There was a grim, circular logic to it. He was to be returned to his origins. Under heavy guard, the trembling, weeping man who had ruled an empire was half dragged, half carried back through the familiar corridors of the palace, his destination the one place he feared above all others. The heavy wooden door of the Kafes was unbolted. The chamber that had been his prison for 22 years, the place from which he had been so reluctantly drawn 8 years prior, now became his prison once more. The door slammed shut, and the bolts were thrown home. The final 10 days of Ibrahim's life were a grim epilogue, a return to the silence and terror that had defined his youth. The chamber in the Kafes was unchanged. The same muted light filtered through the same high, barred windows, illuminating the same gilded decorations. But for Ibrahim, the context was now radically different. Previously, the cage had been a place of suspended animation, a prison from which there was the remote, abstract possibility of release. Now, the fear that had once been a constant, low-level hum of anxiety was now a sharp, unceasing scream of pure dread. He was no longer waiting for a summons to a throne or a bowstring. He was simply waiting for the bowstring. His psychological state, already fragile, completely disintegrated. He spent his days and nights in a state of agitated paralysis, pacing the confines of his room, his mind replaying the trauma of his deposition. According to the few accounts that exist of this period, he would alternate between bouts of furious, incoherent rage and periods of profound, catatonic despair. He would shout for his guards, demanding to see his mother, the Grand Vizier, or his son, the new child Sultan. His demands were met with the same suffocating silence that had been the primary feature of his earlier confinement. The servants who brought his food were the same deaf mutes who had attended him before, their faces impassive masks, offering no human response to his pleas or his threats. He refused to eat, convinced that his food was poisoned. This was not an irrational fear. The assassination of deposed or inconvenient figures by poison was a common practice. His captors, however, had no need for such subtleties. They had a far more direct and legally sanctioned method in mind. His refusal to eat only served to weaken him further, hastening the physical and mental decay that was already consuming him. He reportedly lost a significant amount of weight, his body becoming as gaunt and broken as his mind. He was haunted by the faces of the men he had ordered killed, by the memory of his own absolute power, now rendered absolute power, now rendered utterly meaningless. The cage had become a perfect torture chamber, its luxury and comfort a grotesque counterpoint to the relentless psychological agony of its inmate. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the Kafes, the new regime was consolidating its power, and in doing so, confronting a dangerous and destabilizing problem, the continued existence of the former sultan. Ibrahim, even as a prisoner, remained a potent symbol. As long as he was alive, he was a potential rallying point for any faction that might grow dissatisfied with the new government. A loyal pasha, the disaffected regiment of janissaries, or a courtier who under the new order could launch a counter-coup with the stated goal of liberating the rightful sultan. The presence of a living, deposed monarch was a permanent source of political instability. The debate among the senior viziers and the leaders of the Yulma was brief and pragmatic. The child sultan, Mehmed IV, was only 6 years old. The regency was in the hands of his grandmother, Qasim Sultan, but her position was not yet fully secure. The state was still fragile. The precedent of Sultan Mustafa I, who had been deposed, reinstated, and then deposed again, was a cautionary tale they all remembered. The risk of a restoration, however remote, was too great. The fatwa that had legitimized Ibrahim's deposition had been based on his unfit to rule. A second fatwa was now sought, one that would address the final disposition of the problem. The question was again posed to the Syhul Islam. Is it permissible under the law to execute a deposed ruler if his continued existence poses a clear and present danger to the peace and stability of the state? The legal principle invoked was that of maslaha, or public interest. The argument was a familiar one in the brutal calculus of dynastic politics. The life of one man, however sacred his former office, could be sacrificed for the security of the many. Having already sanctioned the deposition, had little choice but to follow the political logic to its conclusion. He issued the second fatwa. It was a death sentence. The public interest required the elimination of the threat. The decision was relayed to the Grand Vizier. The necessary orders were given. The chief executioner of the palace was summoned. Ibrahim's final, desperate appeals, which could still be heard echoing from his chamber, would soon be silenced for good. The decision, once ratified by the second fatwa, was irrevocable. The machinery of state execution, which had lain dormant for the deposed sultan for a brief 10 days, was now reactivated. The Grand Vizier, Safu Mehmed Pasha, a man who owed his precarious position to his role in the coup, understood that any hesitation would be interpreted as weakness and could unravel the new regime. He summoned the Bostan Biaz, the chief of the palace guards who also traditionally served as the chief executioner, and relayed the final command. The execution was to be carried out immediately, without delay or ceremony. A small, grim delegation assembled to witness the act. It included the Grand Vizier himself and several other high-ranking Pashas who had been instrumental in the deposition. Their presence was not a matter of morbid curiosity. It was a legal and political necessity. They were there to serve as official witnesses, to ensure that the sentence was carried out as decreed, and to foreclose any future possibility of rumor or denial that the former sultan might still be alive. Their collective presence transformed the act from a clandestine assassination into a formal procedure of state. The procession made its way through the silent corridors of the palace to the sealed chambers of the Kafes. The bolts were drawn back, the heavy door groaning open to reveal the dim, perfumed interior. Ibrahim, who had been in a state of agitated prostration, looked up. The sight of the Grand Vizier, accompanied by the chief executioner holding the coiled silk bowstring, extinguished any lingering hope he may have harbored. There was no ambiguity in this visitation. This was the moment he had been rehearsing in his mind for his entire life. His reaction was not one of rage, but of a desperate, final appeal to the order he had once commanded. He reportedly addressed the Grand Vizier directly, his voice trembling but coherent. "If there is a claimant to my throne, let him come forward," he is said to have pleaded, attempting to invoke the very dynastic legitimacy that his own actions had forfeited. He was trying to engage them in a political encounter back from the precipice of pure, physical violence. But his words fell into a void. The men before him were not there to debate the finer points of succession law. They were the instruments of a final, irreversible political calculation. At this point, a remarkable and well-attested event occurred. The chief executioner, a man named Kara Ali, whose hands were responsible for the deaths of countless officials on the orders of this very sultan, hesitated. To strangle a disgraced pasha or a rebellious courtier was one thing, to lay violent hands upon the body of a man who had, until a few days prior, been the padishah, the caliph of all Muslims, was an act of a different magnitude. The immense, quasi-divine aura of the office, ingrained in every subject of the empire, had not entirely dissipated. He reportedly recoiled, his nerve failing him. The Grand Vizier, seeing the hesitation, was incensed. This was the most dangerous possible moment for the coup. A failure of will now could shatter the entire enterprise. He berated the executioner in harsh, guttural whispers, reminding him of his duty and of the fatwa that sanctioned the act. According to some chronicles, he and the other viziers had to physically push the trembling executioner forward into the room. This brief moment of human reluctance, of a professional killer balking at the sacrilege of his task, underscores the profound gravity of the act they were about to commit. Finally, spurred on by the threats and shoves of the viziers, the executioners fell upon the former sultan. The struggle was brief. Ibrahim was physically weakened by his 10-day fast and psychologically shattered. They forced him to the ground. The preferred instrument that avoided the taboo of shedding royal blood was looped around his neck. Two men pulled at either end. The application of force was methodical. After a few minutes, the body lay still. The Grand Vizier stepped forward to confirm the cessation of life. The political problem that was Ibrahim had been solved. The body of the 37th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire lay on the floor of the same room, where he had spent his youth in terror of this exact fate. The cycle was complete. The act was done. The body of the former Sultan Ibrahim lay cooling on the carpets of his final and first prison. There was no ceremony of mourning. His remains were wrapped unceremoniously in a plain shroud and taken for a swift, quiet burial in the precinct of the Hagia Sophia, interred in the tomb of his volatile predecessor, Sultan Mustafa I. It was a fitting final resting place. One mad sultan lay to rest beside another, the two greatest failures of the institutional experiment known as the Kafes. In the city, the news of his execution was announced not as a tragedy, but as a deliverance. The state, having surgically removed its own diseased head, now moved quickly to install the new one. The formal accession ceremony of the 6-year-old Mehmed IV was a stark contrast to the terrified, confused affair that had marked his father's ascension. This was a carefully managed piece of political theatre. The child, dressed in miniature robes of state and a jeweled turban too large for his head, was seated upon the Ottoman throne. One by one, the great men of the empire, the viziers, the military commanders, the senior clergy stepped forward to kiss the hem of his robe, pledging their allegiance not to the boy, but to the symbol he represented, the continuity of the dynasty and the restoration of order. The child, by all accounts, watched the proceedings with a mixture of bewilderment and fear, a silent pawn in a game whose rules he could not begin to comprehend. The true center of gravity in the throne room was not the small boy on the dais, but the figure who now emerged from the shadows of her exile. Qasem Sultan returned from the old palace to Topkapi in a grand procession, a public reclamation of her rightful place. She was once again valid as Sultan and, more importantly, the officially declared regent for her grandson. Her power was now more absolute than it had ever been. She was the undisputed master of the new regime. Her first acts were swift and decisive, designed to reward her allies and permanently eliminate the remnants of the old order. The viziers and pawsers who had engineered the coup were confirmed in their positions and showered with honors. The Janissary Corps received a massive donative from the treasury, a traditional payment upon the accession of a new sultan that served the dual purpose of securing their loyalty and quieting their financial grievances. Simultaneously, a ruthless purge of Ibrahim's favorites was initiated. The men and women who had enabled and profited from his madness found that their protector's death was their own death sentence. The most prominent target was Sinsi Hockey. The mystic who had once commanded the Sultan's soul was arrested and his vast, ill-gotten fortune was confiscated by the state. The sheer scale of his wealth, palaces, jewels, and chests overflowing with gold coins scandalized even the jaded officials of the treasury. His claims of mystical power could not save him from a very worldly fate. After a brief interrogation to locate the last of his hidden assets, he was unceremoniously executed. The favored concubines, including the once powerful Sahib Kar Undesi Ker, were stripped of their titles and their immense wealth. Their lands, their jewels, and their revenues were seized and returned to the imperial coffers. They were cast down from the pinnacle of the harem and relegated to the obscurity of the old palace. Their brief, meteoric reign over. The new government was methodically erasing every trace of the previous regime, salting the earth from which it had grown. The empire had a child on the throne and a formidable old woman as its regent. The Cretan War still raged. The treasury was still in crisis, but the immediate pathology at the center had been excised. The body was buried. A boy was placed upon the throne. The accounts of the state were, for a time, rebalanced. The story of Sultan Ibrahim I is often dismissed as a historical anomaly, a bizarre and lurid footnote in the long chronicle of the Ottoman Empire. But to see it merely as the tale of a single mad king is to miss its more profound and unsettling lesson. It is an autopsy of a system. Ibrahim was not a cause, but a symptom, the predictable and catastrophic product of an institution, the Kafes, that was designed to solve a political problem by creating a psychological one. It chose mental ruin as a humane alternative to the bowstring, and in doing so, it incubated a form of chaos far more corrosive than any civil war. The true tragedy is not that a broken man was given absolute power, but that the entire edifice of a great empire, its armies, its laws, its clergy, its courtiers reconfigured itself to accommodate, facilitate, and ultimately profit from his pathologies. The state did not resist his madness. It became the instrument of his madness. His private sensory obsessions became matters of public finance, and his personal anxieties dictated foreign policy. The line between the Sultan's mind and the empire's reality dissolved completely, and when the system could no longer bear the weight of his unraveling, it did what it was designed to do. It eliminated the man, but it preserved the system that had made him. This story is over, but the weaknesses it exposed, fear, superstition, the psychophancy that thrives in the shadow of absolute power, are not historical artifacts. They are part of us. They final thought before you sleep.